Hey there. Make sure my volume's up. Oh, there we go. Give it a minute or so for other people to chime in. Hello, Peaches and Sugar, Jean from Nova Scotia Valley. I'm glad to be back. Didn't think the electricity would ever come back on. All right, well, it's 7 o'clock. We have a lot of stuff to talk about, so we're going to go ahead and go for it. So, hello again. It's Jimmy here in Boileau, Quebec. It is 20 degrees Celsius. We are in full planting swing as we are harvesting asparagus, other fantastic perennial crops like mint and lemon balm, chives, stinging nettles, comfrey. The first a lot of greenhouse greens, the first radishes outside, and we're transplanting and seeding almost every day. So it brings up the question, has our last frost date passed? Well, I'm cautiously optimistic, and I think so. This year is very emblematic of 2017 when it was extremely wet in May, and our last frost then was the 20th of May. We had one on the 25th of May of this year. So yeah, I think our last frost date is passed. So when I've been checking the temperature, it's been the last 8-day average is about 13 degrees Celsius at night, which is really warm. So for us, it's time to get planting. So tonight brings us into the discussion, the warm and settled date, growing in these ever-changing climates, and maintenance on crops as they get bigger. But before we start all that, I wanted to touch upon how to transplant your little seedlings, the best practices. And I know that the last time we spoke, we had a discussion, I didn't mention it. So I would like to talk about that. So now if we're talking about our little seedlings that are in our 50 cell trays or our small little cells that we're going to plant, or if we're talking 3.5, 4-inch pots that we want to transplant in, either one, it doesn't matter. The philosophy and the process of transplanting is the same. So really, whenever possible, it's best to do it in the morning when the temperatures are cool, when it's cloudy, even a little rainy is fine, because what we're trying to do is eliminate that transplant shock. And if it's full sun, especially if it's afternoon, if it's full sun when we plant those little seedlings, they're really going to have a tough time. We're already disturbing their roots a little bit. Going to put them in, the sun's going to beat on them, and they're just going to wilt. So best to try and do it when it's cloudy. For sure, do it early in the morning. I know in my planting days in Arizona, there was no such thing as a cloudy day during planting season, so it would be really early in the morning. Even 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning is not too early for these little plants. So when you have your little seedling tray or when you have your bigger pot, gently remove the baby transplant from its container, disturbing the roots as little as possible. So shout out to, hello, Ann. Good to see you, or good to have you there so you can see me. So remove the baby transplant from the container, disturbing the roots as little as possible. Then what you want to do is you want to make a hole bigger than the root ball. So if the root ball is small like that, then you just want to make it a little bigger, and you can use your hands. If you're taking a 3.5-inch pot, using a trowel is really efficient. And you want to make a hole a little bit bigger than the root ball. So when you put it in, you're not squeezing the transplant in, it's sitting in that hole just nicely. For all transplants, you want to keep the soil level the same. So if your broccoli seedling is coming out of its little cell, then when you pop it out of the cell tray and you put it into the ground, just make sure it's exactly at the same soil level. There's only a couple of things that it really doesn't matter and actually want to be planted a little deeper. One is tomatoes, and tomatoes can be planted up to their first 2 true leaves. And that's because the entire stem is going to create kind of a root network. All those little fuzzy hairs that are on the stem are going to branch out and root and help hold the plant down. The other one that wants to be planted deeper is a leek. So when you're planting leeks, different than say onions, where you have the shaft, and if you're talking a bulbing onion, you really want the light to get in, so that'll actually spark them to bulb. The leek you can actually plant all the way up the bulb stem. So the entire thing is planted. Even if some of the leaves of the leek are planted, it's okay too. After you've done all that, after you've gotten all your transplants in of whatever varieties they are, water in thoroughly, even using liquid seaweed, as it provides phyto growth hormones and helps to stop transplant shock. That has really been our secret here, and it's worked extremely well. Now, it is for sure that when you put the transplants in the ground, they may not look really good for a little while. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes they just take off. Broccoli and kale are great at this. They can look really, really like they're tired in their cell pots. They don't want to be in there anymore. Their cell trays, they don't want to be there anymore. As soon as you transplant them, they're going to start getting green very, very fast. So I just wanted to mention that about transplanting because I didn't do that before. I'm just going to make a note on time. And that gives you the basic philosophy. And really, it's always the same, always the same. It's just a process. It's a procedure. And doing it the same really works well. If you know, one more thing about watering, if you know it's going to be really, really dry after transplanting, we'll pass 3 or even 4 times on the same plant with a watering can. If you know, like now the ground is wet and there might even be some more rain tonight, you can just pass once with the liquid seaweed and that'll be it. That's all you really need to do. So we're continuing on and we're talking about the warm and settled date. So how do we know this? Well, after the last frost date is passed, the nights really start warming up. Before the last frost date, you might have some nights where they're 15, 16, even 20 degrees, and then it's going to plummet down to 3, 2, and then maybe even freeze for you. But what we're talking about with the warm and settled date is when the temperature has basically stayed stable at about 13 degrees Celsius, 55 degrees Fahrenheit. That temperature, that nighttime temperature, every single plant can handle being outside without a problem at all. They will all start thriving. They will put out more roots. They'll start growing. They'll even keep growing at night. It won't matter anymore. Now, it is sure that even if that warm and settled date passes, when those nights stay at that temperature, it can drop. It's possible that you can have 1 night or 2 nights where it drops down to 7 or 8 degrees. To that point, it doesn't matter because not only are the nights warm, but that's going to help keep the soil warmer. So if you think about where we are at the last frost date, if the days are 25, 26, 27 degrees, so in the 80s Fahrenheit, but then the nights drop down to 3 or 4 degrees, which can happen, well, the soil is going to trap that cold air still because the amount of daylight is long, but it's not as long as it is as we are now, and especially when you get to the warm and settled date. So when the days are warm and then the nights stay warm, well, then the soils are going to stay even warmer. So there you go. That's the other way that we can know how we know that the plants are going to thrive when they're going to be in that warm and settled date temperature zone. So this is usually going to fall between 2 to 3 weeks after the last frost date. Whatever your last frost date is, this is pretty much true universally where it does freeze, that this is going to be your warm and settled date. And like I just said before, everything can be planted. But specifically, this is the timing when you're going to want to be able to plant your outside, all of your cucurbit family. Pretty much, no, for sure your cucumbers, but all of your cucumbers really want to wait until this date. But you could plant your zucchini and even your winter squash before. If you put a cover over them, it would be better. But if you wait until the warm and settled date, it's even better because everything will just thrive. It's also the time that you can plant your basil outside. It'll just take off. Your corn you can plant outside, and your beans as well, especially things like soybeans or edamame or even soybeans for drying. They don't like temperatures at all below 55. Beans can handle it at about 45 degrees. I'm talking bush beans or climbing beans, but they don't really like the temperatures to go that cold. So at that temperature, everything will thrive. So this is why this warm and settled date is so cool and so interesting. You will also be able to predict it when you start feeling the wind shift from the north to the west or the south. When that north wind comes, it means that the Arctic pulse, especially for all of us up here in Canada, that Arctic pulse, or they call it the polar vortex, it kind of drops down. And when it does that, it pushes that cold air down with it. But it always comes from the north, or maybe the northwest or northeast, but it always is coming down from the north. Well, when the winds shift from the west, they actually call that a zephyr, or a drying wind. It's actually a very calm westerly wind, and it's very, very cool when that happens, because you do feel that drying. We used to get storms from the west, but they're usually warm storms. Unfortunately, they're thunderstorms sometimes, but they're warm storms. And then when they come up from the south, yeah, then they're definitely warm, because they're bringing all that warm tropical moisture up with them. That's why sometimes, especially here in Quebec, today is a good example. Yesterday also, where it feels very, very tropical. The moisture, the humidity in the air, it almost feels a little bit like we're in Hawaii, and it's about as green out there as it is in Hawaii. So that's very neat. So that is how you know about your warm and settled date. This brings up a bunch of questions. We've had a lot of good questions for this show, so I'm going to go ahead and start that up. So from Carolyn Harris from Ottawa, on a radio interview that I did with her on CKCU radio, she asked me, what are the easiest plants to grow, and when is the easiest time to plant? I don't really like to answer that question of the easiest plants to grow, because I like every individual gardener, grower, farmer, homesteader to think for themselves what it is they like to eat and then plant accordingly. Like, so if I tell you that, oh yeah, peas are really easy, well, everybody will plant peas. Well, maybe you don't like that many peas. Maybe you really do want to grow broccoli or big heads of cabbage. Well, plant them. That you can become an expert in any plant, and then if you're successful at it, then it was pretty easy, right? So that really is the way I like to answer that question, more than what do I feel are the easiest to plant. What I will say, though, about ease of planting, it is a lot easier to direct seed into the ground at the easiest time, which is the warm and settled date, than it is to try to raise a baby seedling either in your house or in your greenhouse. That is extremely complicated. I've talked about this on a number of shows in the past. If you can become an expert in that, great, but this is complicated because the temperature fluctuations are so much. But until the warm and settled date, you want to direct seed outside. This is the time when you can seed all of your greens and your kale and your beans and your soybeans, and even direct seeds, cucumbers and summer squash, green onions, all of those things that really like to be seeded. But also, this is a time where if you hadn't been able to get around to it before, or if your field or your garden site wasn't prepared yet, you can go ahead and transplant in all your perennials also at the warm and settled date. Again, the warm and settled date is the easiest time to plant, because you're not going to be fighting that frost date anymore, which is a killer for our plants. Yeah, you might have to deal with drought, and you might have to deal with too much rain or severe thunderstorms like we just had, but you're not going to be dealing with the frost. And most plants are resilient enough that they can go ahead and outlast a drought as long as we water them. They can outlast too much water as long as they get a break, and they can outlast even a thunderstorm. These crazy thunderstorms that came through here with 100-mile-per-hour winds over the last that happened on the 21st of May. We didn't lose a single crop in the field. Now, we did have screens on things, but all of our onions, all of our garlic, nothing fell over. They're extremely hardy, extremely tough, and their desire is to grow. So there's the answer to your question, Carolyn. I hope that's kind of what you were thinking. So Matt from Toronto asks how to plant potatoes. Do you cut them or do you plant them whole? Well, it's a really good question, because now is also a really good time to plant potatoes wherever you are if you haven't already. And the potato seed usually comes, and they usually come about 7.5 centimeters, about 3 inches, oval. So the long way is that 7.5 centimeters, maybe it's 2.5 to 3 centimeters tall. in its oval shape. And you can just plant it direct, plant them 12 inches apart, and everything is fine. If they're bigger than that, and sometimes seed potatoes are bigger than that, then go ahead and cut them in half. Don't try to, some resources will tell you to look for the eyes and cut accordingly. So then you end up making this slashing cut or this weird kind of, I don't know, kind of two-way cut to get this weird looking potato. I've done that before, and what I can say is if it's that size, plant it. If it's bigger, just cut it in half and plant the two. Plant the cut side down, everything 12 inches apart in your one row. Make sure you mound and hill your potatoes because most of the potato set is going to be right under the plant. There you go, Matt. There's the answer to that question. Jean from Nova Scotia asked, why are my radishes not bulbing? And this is a really, really interesting question also, because I've had this happen with, especially with seeds that I bought and even seeds that I saved from. So radishes are very unique because radishes, we can eat the greens, which are very healthy for us, and we also eat the bulbs, which is the crisp radish that we all know. So when a seed company is saving their seeds for radish, probably they're big enough that they're just going to go ahead and let all of the radishes go up to flower pretty much as soon as they can. It's called bolting. And then they're going to harvest the seeds when the seed pods dry. But they're not going to maybe take careful attention to see if there was actually a bulb underneath that radish. So instead, what ends up happening is if they save from just a radish that just created a stalk, but there was no radish, which happened, I mean, it has a root, but it's not really a bulb, then you're getting seed for radish greens. You're not getting seed for radish bulbs. So what we do here at La Ferme de l'Eau, because I also save radish, specifically one of our favorites that we seed save every year is an heirloom called d'Avignon, which you really can't find too many places anymore. Now they call it French breakfast, but it's not the same radish seed. D'Avignon is an heirloom from France from the years 1800. So I take careful note as to what are the best looking bulbs. If the bulb, and because it's an elongated radish that's bicolor, if it's elongated one color, I don't save it. If it's elongated but kind of spindly, I don't save it. And I just did this today because we just harvested our first radishes out of the ground to eat. And then I go ahead and thin them out enough so that it gives them enough space so that when they do flower, it makes a nice flowering bush of nice flowering radish hedge, because that's really what it is. So what you need to do with these radishes is we need to make sure that the bulb is what we like and what we're looking for. Even if it doesn't create the most beautiful bulb, it will still make a bulbing radish if we save the seeds from them the year after. But again, if they just saved them from a stalk and there was no radish bulb, then yeah, you basically got seeds for radish greens. So anyway, Jean, I know you're out there tonight. I would go ahead and plant them anyway and then just eat the radish greens because they're very good. Jenny from Ottawa asks, tricks for growing cilantro. All the plants that I have, even the self-seeding ones, are bolting. Yeah, that's really interesting. Cilantro doesn't like hot, and it doesn't like dry, and it doesn't like sunny all the time. It really wants moist soil. It really wants to stay wet. It really loves cloudy. So if you have the conditions that I formerly mentioned, then yeah, it might just go bolting really fast. But this also comes back down to the seed. Depending on the seed that you have, Jenny, it could be that you're planting seed from a fast bolting variety, and there is such a thing. Some people want to plant cilantro specifically for the coriander seed, which makes sense to me. So they do that. They don't want the plant of cilantro. Me personally, I like it both. I want a nice bunch of cilantro for my Mexican dishes or my Indian dishes. And then I also want the seed that I can save and also grind up for those same, well, not for Mexican, but I guess I could put in Mexican, but mostly for the Indian food. So my two favorite varieties that I've used in the past are Santo and calypso. And both of these are really good. Now, a secret, and I'm going to talk about this in a later show a little bit more, a secret is about successions. And succession cropping is when you plant something and then maybe 2 to 3 weeks later you plant it again. Because cilantro, we might end up planting cilantro at a time when there is just too much sun, or it is really too dry, or is too hot, and then that particular sowing or succession will go ahead and bolt quite fast. Well, instead, we want to plant 3 weeks later, and maybe then we will hit a time where it's a little bit cooler. And that's pretty cool. So yeah, there you go. Try a different seed. If it's self-seeding itself, obviously you probably had luck in the past. But I would think it would be that. It's been pretty cloudy even in Ottawa, but if you tried planting it during that exceptionally hot spell that we had the first 2 weeks of May, that would do it. Plant again and you should be okay. So that is those 4 questions. I do have another question, but we'll talk about that here in just a minute. So I'm just going to make another note on timing. That finished up at 21 minutes. Okay, great. So growing in our ever-changing climates, it is becoming increasingly difficult, no matter where any of us are in the world, to grow our own food. It's just becoming tough. And the climate is changing, and it's changing dramatically. It doesn't matter where we live. It's just difficult. And we're going to see exceptional droughts. We're going to see exceptional rains. We're going to see exceptional storms. And it's just going to keep going. While from all the research that I have done, it seems to me that what is making the most sense is the more carbon that we put in the atmosphere, the more carbon dioxide, the more methane, the more N2O, the more nitrous oxide that we're putting in the atmosphere, the more the levels of CO2 equivalent emissions rise. And when that rises, then it changes things in the atmosphere. It blocks things that were moving before. It changes wind directions. When oceans warm up or cool down, ocean currents change, creates different wind temperatures. We get polar vortexes that drop further than they've gone. We get tropical systems that come up faster. The reason why we got this huge thunderstorm on the 21st was supposedly it was 30 degrees Celsius here, or 85 degrees Fahrenheit, and just about 2 hours north it was 10 degrees Celsius or 50 degrees. And it was that squeezing of pressure that caused those intense thunderstorms to come that were spinning those 100-mile-per-hour winds. So it's difficult. I'm going to answer a question. Actually, it was more of a discussion that we were actually having before the thunderstorms hit, and it was all about climate conditions, and it was on Facebook with Jennifer from Indiana and Susan from Northern California. How do we try to grow when temperatures go from 95 degrees Fahrenheit, 35 degrees Celsius, to 39 degrees Fahrenheit, 4 degrees Celsius, 36 hours later? Yeah, that's really the trick, right? How do we go from these hot extremes to these cold nights? And the best thing I can say is to be as diverse as possible. And if you think about nature, if we look at nature, and if we look at a vibrant forest system, if we look at a vibrant grassland ecosystem, you're not going to just have one crop, and you're not just going to have 5 types of grass. You're going to have 20 different kinds of prairie grasses and native flora. And in the forest, you're not just going to have one tree. Well, at least not in a healthy forest. You're not going to have just one tree. You're not just going to have 2 trees. You're going to have layers of trees and bushes and small shrubs and grasses and ground covers. So when we're thinking about our gardening and growing systems, we really want to consider this. Now, it's not always feasible to create sort of a food forest where we're going the 7 layers of growing, from the smallest plants to the tallest trees. And we're also not looking at creating a grassland ecosystem in our garden spaces because we don't need grass. But we can look at planting different crops that go together or seem to want to live together at different times in as much diversity as possible. So a great example is, say, perennial herbs. Now you can grow perennial herbs and flowers pretty much wherever you live based on your climate zone, which is the zone of how cold your winters get. And you can go ahead and plant accordingly to what you want to do. So you could plant things like chives and lemon balm and mint in close proximity to each other, sage. You can even plant, say, up here, you can plant rosemary. We have somebody from South Texas. They can grow rosemary year long as they have enough water in the Rio Grande Valley. So maybe so. So I think that if we think about this when we're growing, say, any kind of perennials, and we're putting them together, what that is going to do is that if one fails, something else is going to thrive. When the moisture comes, it's going to be shared. When it's dry, they're going to shade each other, and they're going to conserve that moisture. This is the benefit of companion planting. And really, when you're talking herbs, some are more some are more aggressive than others, where you're going to have some that are going to want to take more space. So mint really wants to take a lot of space. You can plant it here, and 2 years later, it's maybe 20 feet away. Well, you can just kind of pull some of it out and create the areas that you want, create the planting scenarios that you want with these perennials. It's about managing them. But again, it's about diversity. Within that, you can plant perennial flowers. You can plant even annual flowers with them. And again, it's to create the diversity, which importantly is not just for us, but for all beings to share. When we are creating our gardens and we're planting for all beings, it's going to bring more nurturing and nutrition to all of us, because the plants are going to thrive because of the insect activity and the small mammal activity and the amphibian activity. So it's going to be better for us, but better for them, better for everyone. So think about that in your gardening systems when you have that. But a lot about this show, we're talking about the foods that we eat all the time. And so since we're talking the warm and settled day, let's talk about things like tomatoes, and let's talk about peppers and eggplant and ground cherries. Can you plant these things side by side together? Well, again, like I talked about on the last show, you can plant everything. If it's a cherry, tomato, or pepper, they want to all be 12 inches, 30 centimeters apart. You can plant them all 12 inches, 30 centimeters apart if you want to do that. You can also plant a line of tomatoes, which is fine too, or 2 lines, and that's fine too. But it's not just about planting just tomatoes or just peppers or just eggplant or just ground cherries, which are all the same family. You also want to plant your alliums. You also want to plant your brassicas. You also want to plant your carrots. You want to plant your beets. You want to plant potatoes, which is the same family as the Solanaceae. So you want to plant celery, and you want to plant fennel, and you want to plant everything that you can within the space that you can. So again, to come back to Carolyn's question, which is, what are the easiest plants to grow? The easiest way to grow is as much as possible, because it is for sure. And even as a small farm, we have losses that happen based on timing. So I have maybe 50 feet, 100 feet of greens down there that were planted just before that inundation of rain that we had with that thunderstorm, and they may or may not do. But 2 weeks later, we planted again. So we can think about this in our gardening systems, and it doesn't even have to be a lot. Like, I'm starting to think about this from a more homestead perspective, and I did this in my greenhouse this year, where normally I would plant, say, 30 feet of lettuces and then 10 feet or 15 feet of mustard greens, and then mix the two together to make mesclun mix to sell. But what always happens is the mustard greens always get so big, and then they get kind of fibrous, and I need to cut them down, and they don't grow back as well. So instead, I grew just 1 foot, and it was more than enough. And it's just something to think about within our gardening system. So when you have your gardening plan and you're thinking about your gardening system, think about that diversity. How can we plant more how can we plant more different types of crops, and especially all the different types of families? Because when you have failures of one, if you have that diversity, it won't matter that much. Okay, so you don't eat your first round of carrots, but if you planted carrots 3 weeks later, well, then you can eat your second round of carrots. There you go. That's my philosophy on growing in ever-changing climates. And it's so much more than that, because we also want to try to protect from the elements a little bit. With the increase of heat and humidity in the north or in the south, we're going to have different insect pressures that we've never seen before. We're going to have insect beings that are going to migrate up. We're going to have bird species that are going to come and take care of a lot of those insect species. But the way predator-prey relationships work is you always need to have an abundance of prey before the predators show up. There you go. So if you're going to have an influx, and this is why sometimes there are like these vast infestations of, say, caterpillars in the forest. Well, because there was nothing to eat them, because we didn't know, nature didn't know that it was coming. All of a sudden it was there. And the predators, specifically the birds that were going to show up to eat them, weren't there. But if there's some lingering population left over, then the next year is going to be a boom year for whatever bird species take those caterpillars and feed them to their babies to grow up to live on. So that's the cool thing about how nature works. So when we're thinking about our gardening systems, think about how nature works. Try to plant accordingly. Something new to me this year that happened, which was interesting, and it's really because of the crazy type of spring we had, the really, really wet May. It made one of my fields completely impassable. It was so muddy. It was so anaerobic. I couldn't even get in there. I mean, I went into one place and it just will not hold any more water. The water is just starting to billow up and it smells like oil. It's awful. So you can't plant. So instead, I worked the beds, which are always permanent, very delicately with a small hand or a small hand fork. And I seeded cover crop. I seeded alfalfa, which I can cut down and make compost with. I seeded Sudan grass, which is a grass that can be grown very easily down in South Texas, which supposedly gets up 12 feet tall. It's actually a type of sorghum. So if anybody has ever seen cane grass, it's kind of the idea. There's sugar cane, and then there's something called cane grass, which is the same family, but just doesn't make the cane. So that's really interesting too, because that'll grow up to maybe, even if it doesn't get 12 feet because of the moisture retention problem that I have in that field, maybe it gets up to 5 or 6 feet. Well, I can cut it down with a scythe, and then I can cut it with some hand garden scissors and put it in my compost, make compost with it. This is great. And then just return it back into the soil. I also planted oats down there, which we can do the same thing with for composting, but we also harvest the oat groat, and then we can plant those, or my wife makes kind of an herbal tea mix with it, because it's really good for a woman's menstrual cycle. So it's really helpful for that. So these are things that we think about, that even when we have these challenging climactic situations that happen, we can turn things around for the benefit of us and for all beings. And what I noticed, what's so great about cover cropping, is it doesn't give us any food to eat, but it does provide us with cover crop or green matter that we can then make compost from. But it allows for other plants that other beings really enjoy to exist. So when you have a cover crop there's also a bunch of native flora that comes up with it. So it creates the canopy effect. And whenever you have that canopy effect, you're going to have all the different insect beings that like to be there. Here we have just a ton of gopher snakes that really, really like that really dense kind of foliage where they can just move around and go look for mice. We have leopard frogs that bounce around in there, that are only in the places where that it's kind of moist and wet. They're very similar to I think they call it a marsh frog, and a marsh leopard frog. Anyway, they have spots and lines, and they're beautiful, but they really like it wet and humid, and where the greenery is really, really lush. So we're creating something different. On that same note, we have another patch of strawberries and anybody who's ever grown strawberries before, you can create a nice bed. First year you can plant your strawberries, they'll be just fine. Don't harvest the strawberries the first year. Usually you pop the flowers off and you harvest the second year because that's when it's better. But because of the way strawberries work, they're a vining plant. They really don't mind other native flora to be living with them. They will just allow that competition to come in and they'll end up growing with it. Well, most people, and as well as we would go ahead and weed out quite dramatically all of the other plants and quite often that were there just to have the strawberries. And we did that for last year. And we had a strawberry crop. It was fine. We harvested maybe 20 pounds. It was pretty good from 6 rows. But we had to battle the late freeze, so we had to cover, and then we had pollination issues. And so in the end, it wasn't that great. Well, we decided, and we tried to go ahead and weed them again in the fall, but it just got away from us. We got too busy with other things. And we just said, you know what, forget it. We're just going to see what happens. Really, really interesting. So what's happened is usually the strawberries are quite a small plant, but because there were so many dandelions down there this year that we decided to let go, as we normally do, because it's one of the first flowers that the bumblebees really enjoy, and also the smaller native bees really enjoy. The strawberry plants are super tall. They're maybe 50 centimeters tall. Amazing. And the flowers, instead of going down the side, they're actually coming up. They're actually looking for the sun. And I just looked today and there's actually really small strawberries set on them. So I don't know. There is something sometimes about the way these things work. Now, I don't know what the harvest is going to be. I don't know what the yield is going to be. But if you are in a situation where you have a perennial crop or a biennial crop like strawberries, well, even strawberries you can harvest for 3 or 4 years, maybe it's okay to just let all of the native flora go along with it. Instead of fighting nature, we just work with nature. How about that? Another point on us as humans. Now, us as humans and this whole idea of growing in ever-changing climates, we are extremely adaptable because of the technologies that we have created to try and circumvent nature. So for a great example is air conditioning and heating. We probably wouldn't do so well if we didn't have air conditioning in places that's really, really hot, or heating in places that was really, really cold. We wouldn't last very long. We don't have thick skin. Thick fur. We couldn't really survive outside for that long these days. We've lost that genetic capability. And because of our incredibly destructive and unsustainable actions like leveling and mining and paving and polluting, the Earth Mother is figuring this out. And what she does, this is just my opinion, but this is something that I observed. Before I was ever a farmer, I was a naturalist, and I'm still a naturalist. So I observe kind of these fluctuations in floral and faunal beings based on how it's working within nature. And whenever there's an overpopulation, or whenever there's a species that's destructive, the Earth Mother has a way of getting rid of it, bringing in a virus, bringing in temperate conditions that cause droughts or floods. She does this not because she wants to, or she is getting her way, but because Mother Nature is always in a state of balance. And because us humans are so out of balance, we don't even recycle our own poo to go back into the soil to then use in a great capacity, which is this amazing resource that we could be using. The Earth Mother is recognizing this, and she is bringing these climactic events to try, in my opinion, and put our numbers down, because we're not acting sustainably to the land. So it's something to think about. So when we're, again, to go back to planting, so the way that we can harmonize with the natural world, the way that we can live in harmony with the Mother Earth is to plant as diversely as possible. It's what she does. In places where she can, where she is left alone, that's what happens. You'll get some species thrive, and then underneath that, they'll create another system of species, and then more species will come in. And this is really great. There was a really interesting documentary I saw. You guys should check it out. It's the last documentary by David Attenborough. I think it was his testimonial. It's called Life on Earth, My Life on Earth. And he started it in it's pictures of in the Ukraine right after Chernobyl, which was the huge nuclear accident that happened in 1986. Well, after that happened, that entire town was evacuated. So a lot of people died. A lot of species died. Trees were burnt to the crisp. It was just a wasteland. But nobody moved back there because the radioactive levels of Chernobyl were very, very high for a very, very long time. So it basically became an empty place of humans. Well, in this documentary is super cool, which was done in 2021. So we're talking 35 years later. Wouldn't you believe that the trees took over the buildings? There were some that were 75, 80 feet tall. The foxes were there. Other species that they don't have anywhere else in the Ukraine or Russia were there. It just became a natural playground. And this is what happens. And it really doesn't take very long. Like if we took 5 years, 10 years and did nothing with the landscape, it would just pulse and radiate. So with our gardening systems, when we're thinking about them, use only the space that we need, not too much. Let the rest go wild. If you have a section of your garden that is already trying to rewild itself and really you're beating your head against the wall trying to weed it away so you can grow there, don't grow there. Grow some other place or just let it go. This is how we can grow in our ever-changing climates. I hope that makes sense to you all. It really made sense to me thinking about it all these years, my 18 years as a farmer, my 25 years of growing food, my 28 years as being a naturalist. It makes sense to me to work with nature in all of our aspects. It really started making a lot more sense when I became vegan 8 years ago. So there you go. Work with nature. We can still do this. We can still change the course of things if we really completely change our habits as human beings. So hope you liked my little rant. Okay, continuing on. After the growing and after we start getting everything transplanted and everything's in the ground and we have all the different plant families and stuff that likes hot and stuff that likes cold and we have our successions planted. Now is the time that we're starting to think about the maintenance of these crops as they get bigger. And I think what I'm going to do, because I'm going to have another show, and I'm just going to mention that here a little bit later. I'm going to have another show next week. Oh, there she is. I'm going to have another show next week because I lost a week due to the storm. So we're going to talk about maintenance of the things that are in the ground now or going in the ground soon. And then we're going to talk about the maintenance of other things, all of the more tender annuals later. But all maintenance is going to have about five different variables that every plant is going to need. So the maintenance of all crops they're going to need to be weeded. They may need to be supported in some way. If possible, they can use some sort of undersowing of a cover crop or be companion planted in some way. There can be a foliar fertilization if it's a plant that grows for a long time or is quite a heavy feeder, and the watering. Okay, so let's talk about some that we've probably all planted, but here we'll just talk about some that we have planted. So let's talk about peas, some sativa. So we grow 3 different kinds of peas. We grow English shelling peas, which are the peas just for eating fresh, just the pea. There's snap peas, which you can actually that snap and they're sweet, and you eat the pod and the pea. And then there's the snow peas, which aren't quite that sweet, and you usually eat them in the long and thin, the long and flat stage. Sometimes you see them in Chinese cooking, Asian cooking. You can also eat those fresh. So those are 3 different kinds of peas that we grow. We make sure that the bed is completely weeded 100% before we plant the seeds of the pea. Because if not, then what is going to happen is the peas, which like to germinate in about 7 days, they may rot from having too much moisture around the pea. So if you've ever tried planting peas and you like a spot and weren't really sure, and the weeds started coming up and there were no peas, well, it's because the little pea is very fussy just at that beginning. After that, she pretty much takes off. So after a certain height, and I just did this yesterday, after a certain height, the pea gets up to about maybe 3 inches, 7.5 centimeters, 4 inches, 10 centimeters. And they start putting out a tendril, which is a little rudder that they're looking to grip onto something. And all peas do this. It's very neat. Climbing beans do the same thing. Well, climbing beans do it by climbing, but peas do it with what's called a tendril. And they need something to grab onto. And so what you need to figure out if you're growing peas is how to do that. Here I use 1 inch by 2 inch lumber, and I just run like hemp twine or sisal twine around the poles, and they go down 50 feet. And I do this a few times at different heights, and I even cross in between, like 4 rows of peas. I'll have 2 lines of stakes, and I'm going to take a picture of this and post it on Facebook in a few days. And I'll run the line through so that when the tendrils start gripping, they have something to grip onto. And then when they grip onto something, then they grow, and then they grip again, and then they grow, and they grip again, and that's how they go. And that's specific to the pea. And that's what's very interesting about all this also, and comes back a little bit to Carolyn's question, what's the easiest things to grow? Well, every culture is unique. Every single crop, even variety, depending on day length that we grow, may have different requirements, may want different things. So the best advice I can give, besides planting diversely, watching and following nature, is to just do it. Plant as much as you can and get experience, because that is the big kicker. The only way I know as much as I do is because I've been doing it every year for 25 years. And if I didn't, then I wouldn't know. I couldn't just talk about it if I didn't know about it. So, and the best way that you can know about it is by doing it. You read about it, and sometimes it makes sense, and sometimes it doesn't make sense at all. And I know, because I've read my fair share of gardening books. But once you watch it, once you plant the seed into the ground, once you plant the pea into the ground, then you watch it grow, and you see the little tendril, and you go, oh, okay, now I understand what Jimmy was talking about. I see that. And then you watch it grow and grow and grow and grow and grow, and then you understand by witnessing it. So no matter what the crop is, witness it. So for peas, we weed, we stake. Can we undersow with a cover crop? Yeah, but peas itself are a nitrogen-fixing crop. They're legumineurs. They're in the bean and pea family. So they kind of do that job already. So you don't really need to put in on anything underneath. Plus, peas, they like to be humid to a certain point, but if you have too much humidity with other plants growing, then it's going to start creating fungus on the pea plants themselves, and they're not going to like it as much. So for undersowing, because of that specific crop, they don't need it. And we're going to talk about another crop here in just a minute that will. Foliar fertilization. I never foliar feed. And when I talk about foliar fertilization, we're going to talk all about this in cover cropping and weeding next week, the 9th of June. When I'm talking foliar fertilization, I'm talking about using things like nettle or comfrey or yarrow or even clover, horsetail, and making your own plant-based teas or plant-based fermentations. Now, studies on this is very, very limited, but from my experience, and I've been doing it every twice, 3 times a year, every year since 2016. I can't say that there's anything adverse that happens by using this fertilization method. And for me, it's kind of like giving a tonic to the plant. Like sometimes we drink like an herbal tea sort of to give us vigor. Well, it's kind of the same thing for the plant. Yeah, there's nitrogen in it, there's phosphorus in it, there's potassium in it, there's microelements in it. But I just think the plants enjoy that liquid love, so to speak, and it just makes them more robust, makes them more resistant to whatever that they would need to grow in their life. So this is my take on foliar feeding. But I never foliar feed anything that I'm eating the leaf or the pod of at the pod setting stage. So I won't even spray peas when the peas are there, when the peas are there, because of the foliar fertilization. What we use mostly is nettles and comfrey. It stinks. It stinks really bad. It stinks kind of like manure. So I only put it on the crops that need to would like to have something that would give them vigor for a longer period of time. Peas are very fast. They're 50, 55 days from planting from seed, so sometimes 60 days. So they really, once they establish them, they grow well. Watering. The general rule on everything that we've transplanted or seeded is if you just direct seeded it, water it until you see it come up. As soon as you see it come up, back off the watering. There's nothing that we can do about the rain. That's just going to happen. But if you have the opportunity to make to irrigate or not irrigate, the bigger the plant is, the less you need to water. It can even go really, really dry. And again, the general rule for this is put your finger in, and if up to your third knuckle, I guess, no, that would be your 1, 2, 3. Yeah, to your third knuckle there. And it's a pretty tall plant, then you don't need to water. But if it's dry at that point, then water it. A seed, water it until it's germinated. And even when it's germinated, water a little bit, but then you can back off, let it go dry, because the drier you let a plant go, the more roots it's going to put out, and the further the roots are going to go, because it's going to seek that water. One thing about nutrients, roots will only be able to uptake nutrients at a certain moisture level. If it's too wet, they won't be able to uptake it. If it's too dry, they won't be able to uptake it. So the deeper, the drier, but with still a little moisture it is the perfect time for the plants to look and grab those nutrients, to let the plant grow. So those are peas. But let's talk about a different family, maybe one a little bit more complicated, and that's broccoli. So broccoli is in the brassica family. Broccoli also, we will have a nice clean bed that has been completely weeded before we plant our broccoli transplants. And those are from transplants, those aren't from seed. So we plant our transplants, we water in, we put a little liquid seaweed, like I had mentioned at the beginning of the show, because that helps the transplant shock. Staking, they don't need any staking. A broccoli plant, if grown well, will have a nice thick stalk, which is kind of what you see when you buy broccoli in the grocery store if you've grown broccoli before. We'll have big leaves that will kind of help balance it in the winds, and then we'll create a central crown. And depending on the broccoli type, might also take florets and come up from sort of the inverted armpit of the of the broccoli plant. Broccoli, though, because it's a heavy feeding crop, it's a brassica, they like a lot of nitrogen to create those green leaves. And because we're eating actually the flowering head, it likes to have a lot of nitrogen. It's like, we will underseed this crop with an annual clover, one that doesn't mind being in the shade. Now, timing is crucial with this, because you don't want to plant the clover too fast, because the clover will then, like what happened to us last year, the clover will outgrow the broccoli. The broccoli will still grow through it, but I think that the size of the broccoli was jeopardized a little bit. So you want to wait. You want to wait maybe a month after you've transplanted the broccoli to then seed an annual clover. And that's going to feed feed the plant by creating little nitrogen nodules that then the broccoli plant can go ahead and find. There will also be mycorrhizae as the two work together, because supposedly broccoli does not associate with mycorrhizal fungi, but nitrogen fixing plants do. And so what the mycorrhizal fungi do is they help also move nutrients throughout the soil that then the plants grab onto. Very, very cool the way that works. It's a huge underground network that we don't see. Foliar feeding, yes, absolutely. I would foliar feed a broccoli plant. I would go ahead and spray it one time probably. I don't think it would need more than that before I start seeing the head. And again, when I start seeing the head, I don't spray it. But in that family, there's also things like kale and collard greens. I never spray those at all because I don't want that smell to permeate the leaves. Whereas for the broccoli plant, it's fine. And if that broccoli plant is looking for a foliar feed of, say, nitrogen or phosphorus, which is going to be helpful for the root system, or for potassium, which is going to be helpful for the flower to be created, which is what we eat, then it's going to like that. It's going to like that a lot. And watering less. Broccoli is interesting because it can stay pretty wet all the time. But I have noticed that with broccoli that the head will get tighter, will taste better if there is a little bit of a dry spell as it gets to that point. So we're going to talk about maintenance again next time a little bit, because there's other crops I didn't talk about, like tomatoes, which some people have already planted, but we're planting this coming Sunday, so it's going to be perfect timing. And other things that want different requirements, like maybe they want straw mulch underneath. So we're going to talk about that a little bit next time. So next show, June 9th, 1 week from tonight, same time, same YouTube channel. We're going to talk about the Zen of weeding, how to make it pleasurable, how to allow us to breathe, how to let the plants breathe, and how to be in the moment of doing something that a lot of people just don't really like. A little tongue in cheek, but it's quite fun. We're going to talk about plant-based teas. We're going to talk about the best methods for preparation. We're going to talk about how to we're going to talk about the best plants to use, even like what minerals that they might have in there. We're going to talk about all the different kinds of cover crops, and I've used many, and there are some that as home gardeners we should use, and there's some we definitely should not use, especially since we're not using tractors. They can become very aggressive. The root systems can become very root bound very fast, and they can really, really take over our garden spaces. So when our intention was just to feed the soil life or to create biomass, in the end, we just created this perennial cover crop, which is not what we wanted. So that would be our fault that we can go ahead and fix. And again, more on maintenance. We're going to talk about maintenance of the tender annuals and what they'll need. Coming events, there's on the 5th of June, so I guess that would be Sunday. It is National Animal Rights Day. So if you're into it, if you want to get together with your some like-minded people and be that voice that these animals need, because they don't need us to speak for them, but they need us to give them rights so humans start paying attention. That's really what they need. And what and I just saw these all on Facebook. Very cool. There are organized events in Toronto, London, Saskatoon. There's 2 in Montreal, Calgary, and Winnipeg. So if you are into this kind of thing, I've been to many of these kind of events in the past, and they can be quite fun. They can be quite cool. Plus, you're doing something really good for the beings that really need us to start doing good stuff for them. I hope that came across right. But man, we really need to be doing better than we are for all other beings. That's what I wanted to say. So that's what I had for tonight. I thank you, as always, for coming out on these Thursday nights. I know there's many other things you'll be doing now that the weather is starting to be beautiful. I know that you could even still be outside and out on your porch or your terrace, having your favorite beverage at the end of the day with your favorite people, whether human or non-human. And but I really appreciate it. thank you and peace. And I wish you a wonderful week. Till the next time we see each other again next week. So thank you. Have a good night.